Bella Rodriguez had been arranging wedding tables for 3 years at the Grandview Manor, but she'd never seen a bride lose her mind over a slightly tilted centerpiece. What started as whispered complaints quickly escalated into a public humiliation that left Bella questioning everything about her job. But as the bride's voice echoed through the reception hall, something unexpected was happening. The groom, heir to one of the country's most powerful business empires, was watching every cruel word with growing disgust. Hours later, when Bella opened her employee locker, she discovered something that would change her life forever. A small velvet box, containing a diamond necklace, worth more than she made in 5 years, and a note that would unravel everything she thought she knew about that perfect wedding day. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Grandview Manor as Bella Rodriguez carefully balanced a tray of crystal glasses, each one polished to perfection. Her black uniform was pressed and pristine, her dark hair pulled back in the regulation bun that the management insisted upon for all service staff. She moved with practiced grace through the opulent ballroom, where white silk draping transformed the space into something that belonged in a fairy tale. Today was different from the usual corporate events and anniversary parties that filled the manor's calendar. Today was the Blackstone wedding, and everyone from the head chef to the parking attendants knew that this wasn't just any wedding. Victoria Ashford was marrying into one of the most influential families on the East Coast, and her expectations were as high as the price tag on her Vera Wang gown. Bella paused at table 7, adjusting the arrangement of white roses and baby's breath that served as the centerpiece. The flowers had cost more than her monthly rent, a fact that the wedding planner had mentioned at least 6 times during the morning briefing. Everything had to be perfect, down to the precise angle of each fork and the exact spacing between the champagne flutes. "The bride wants the centerpieces exactly 18 inches from the edge of the table," called out Miranda, the wedding coordinator, her clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield. "And remember, the napkins need to be folded in the swan pattern, not the bishop's hat." She was very specific about that. Bella nodded, though she'd already heard these instructions 3 times. She understood the pressure everyone was under. Victoria Ashford had a reputation for being demanding, and her social media following of 2 million meant that every detail of this wedding would be scrutinized by people who lived for luxury lifestyle content. As Bella moved to the next table, she caught sight of the groom through the tall windows that overlooked the manor's gardens. Alexander Blackstone stood alone on the stone terrace, his hands in the pockets of his perfectly tailored morning coat. Even from a distance, there was something about his posture that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. She'd served at enough weddings to recognize the look of a nervous groom, but this seemed different. This looked like regret. The sound of sharp heels clicking across marble interrupted her thoughts. Victoria Ashford swept into the ballroom like a storm front, her wedding dress a masterpiece of silk and lace that probably cost more than most people's cars. Her blonde hair was arranged in an elaborate updo that had taken her stylist 3 hours to perfect, and her makeup was flawless despite the early hour. "The flowers are all wrong," Victoria announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been told no. "These centerpieces look cheap. They're not even centered properly." Bella felt her stomach tighten as Victoria's gaze swept across the room, taking inventory of every imperfection, real or imagined. The wedding planner hurried over, her smile strained at the edges. "Victoria, darling, everything looks absolutely stunning," Miranda said in the soothing tone she reserved for bridezillas. "The photographer is going to love these arrangements. They're exactly what we discussed in our planning sessions." "That's not the point," Victoria snapped, her perfectly manicured finger pointing toward table 7, where Bella had just finished her adjustments. "Look at that centerpiece. It's at least 2 inches off center, and the roses are wilting. How am I supposed to get the perfect photos with substandard decorations?" Bella glanced at the table in question, her trained eye immediately assessing what Victoria was seeing. The centerpiece was perfectly centered, the roses fresh from the florist that morning. But she'd learned long ago that in the service industry, the customer's perception was more important than reality. "I'll fix it right away," Bella said quietly, moving toward the table with quick, efficient steps. She'd dealt with difficult clients before, and the best approach was always to address their concerns immediately, even when those concerns were based on impossibly high standards. But Victoria wasn't finished. "And another thing," she continued, her voice rising with each word. "Why are the champagne glasses so close to the centerpieces? They're going to cast shadows in the photos. Didn't anyone think about the lighting when they set these tables?" The question was clearly rhetorical, but Bella found herself trying to explain anyway. "The glasses are positioned according to the standard place-setting guidelines," she began, but Victoria cut her off with a wave of her hand. "I don't care about guidelines," Victoria said, her blue eyes flashing with irritation. "I care about perfection. This is my wedding day, not some corporate lunch meeting. Every detail needs to be absolutely flawless, and right now, nothing looks right." Bella felt heat rising in her cheeks as other staff members began to gather at the edges of the room, drawn by the increasingly loud conversation. She'd been working weddings for years, and she knew how to create beautiful table settings. More importantly, she knew that the arrangements were exactly as they'd been planned and approved by Victoria herself during the final walkthrough just 3 days ago. "I understand your concerns," Bella said, keeping her voice calm and professional. "Let me adjust the positioning to better suit your vision." "My vision?" Victoria's laugh was sharp and humorless. "My vision was to have a wedding that looked like it belonged in a magazine, not like it was thrown together by someone who learned table setting from watching YouTube videos." The insult hit like a physical blow, and Bella felt her professional composure beginning to crack. She'd spent 3 years at the manor, working her way up from busser to lead service staff. She'd studied hospitality management in her spare time, dreaming of eventually opening her own catering business. Every table she set was arranged with care and attention to detail, even when the clients didn't appreciate the effort. "I've been setting tables for weddings for 3 years, Bella said, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "I know what I'm doing." "Obviously you don't," Victoria shot back, her voice carrying clearly across the ballroom. "Because if you did, I wouldn't have to stand here explaining basic aesthetics to someone who should know better. This is supposed to be the most important day of my life, and you're treating it like it doesn't matter." The accusation was unfair and completely untrue, but Bella bit back her initial response. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not when she was already behind on her student loan payments and her mother's medical bills were piling up. The manor paid better than most service positions in the city, and the tips from high-end events like this one helped her stay afloat financially. "I'll make sure everything is exactly as you want it," Bella said through gritted teeth, moving to adjust the champagne glasses with movements that were perhaps a little more forceful than necessary. "At this point, I'm not sure you're capable of getting anything right," Victoria continued, seemingly unaware that her voice was carrying throughout the entire ballroom. "Maybe I should have insisted on hiring more experienced staff for today. This whole setup looks amateurish." That was when Alexander Blackstone walked through the French doors, his dark hair slightly tousled by the morning breeze. Bella had only seen him from a distance during the wedding planning meetings, but up close, she could see why Victoria had set her sights on him. He was tall and lean, with the kind of confident bearing that came from growing up in wealth and privilege. His dark eyes swept across the room, taking in the tension that hung in the air like smoke. "Is everything all right in here?" he asked, his voice carrying the slight accent that marked him as old-money New England. "I could hear voices from the garden." "Everything is not all right," Victoria said, turning to face her soon-to-be husband with the expression of someone who expected immediate support. "The staff here is completely incompetent. Look at these table settings, Alex. They're a disaster." Alexander's gaze moved from Victoria to Bella, who was still adjusting glasses and trying to make herself invisible. His expression was unreadable, but something in his dark eyes suggested he was seeing more than just the surface of the situation. "The tables look fine to me," he said quietly, and Bella felt a small surge of gratitude for the unexpected support. "Fine?" Victoria's voice rose to a near shriek. "Alex, this is our wedding. Fine isn't good enough. I want everything to be perfect, and this waitress clearly doesn't understand what that means." The word waitress was delivered with the kind of disdain usually reserved for something unpleasant, stuck to the bottom of a shoe, and Bella felt her last thread of patience snap. "My name is Bella," she said, straightening to her full height and meeting Victoria's gaze directly. "And I've been doing my best to make sure your wedding is everything you dreamed it would be. If you're not satisfied with my work, you're welcome to speak to my supervisor. I don't need to know your name, Victoria replied with greed. Icy coldness. What I need is for you to do your job properly, or find someone else who can. This is exactly the kind of attitude that ruins special occasions. You're being paid to serve, not to argue with the people who are paying. Your salary. The comment stung, because it contained just enough truth to hurt. Bella was being paid to serve, and in the hierarchy of the service industry, the customer was always right, even when they were clearly wrong. But there was something about Victoria's tone, the casual cruelty in her dismissal of Bella as a person worth knowing, that pushed past all of her professional training. I'm not arguing, Bella said, her voice tight with controlled anger. I'm trying to explain that the tables are set exactly according to your specifications. If you'd like them changed, I'm happy to do that. But please don't question my competence when I'm following the instructions you gave us. My specifications? Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. I never asked for centerpieces that look like they came from a grocery store florist, and I certainly never asked for champagne glasses that are positioned like we're serving wine at a pizza restaurant. The comparison was so far from reality that even some of the other staff members exchanged glances of disbelief. The flowers had come from the most expensive florist in the city, and the glassware was hand-blown crystal that cost more per piece than Bella made in a day. Alexander cleared his throat, and both women turned to look at him. Victoria, perhaps we should focus on getting ready for the ceremony, he suggested, his tone carefully neutral. The photographer will be here soon, and you wanted to take some pre-ceremony shots in the bridal suite. I'm not going anywhere until this is fixed, Victoria said firmly. I won't have my wedding photos ruined by sloppy table settings. And I want to make sure the staff understands exactly what level of service I expect for the reception. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Bella caught the slight movement out of the corner of her eye. For just a moment, his carefully controlled expression slipped, revealing something that looked remarkably like embarrassment. The tables look beautiful, he said, his voice carrying a note of finality. I'm sure our guests will be impressed by the attention to detail. Alex, you're not looking closely enough, Victoria insisted, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward table 7. Look at this centerpiece. It's completely asymmetrical, and the ribbon on the napkins is wrinkled. How is that attention to detail? Bella watched as Alexander dutifully examined the table setting that she'd spent 20 minutes perfecting. His dark eyes moved from the centerpiece, to the place settings, to the carefully folded napkins, and she could see him searching for the flaws that Victoria insisted were obvious. I don't see any problems, he admitted, after a long moment, and Bella felt a warm rush of vindication. That's because you're not looking with a woman's eye, Victoria said dismissively. Men never notice these things. That's why I need the staff to pay attention to details, because I can't be everywhere at once. The condescension in Victoria's voice wasn't just directed at Bella now, it was aimed at her future husband as well. Alexander's expression darkened, and for a moment, Bella thought he might actually challenge his bride's behavior. Instead, he took a step back and slipped his hands into his pockets. I'm going to check on the musicians, he said quietly. They should be setting up in the conservatory by now. As Alexander walked away, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor, Victoria turned her attention back to Bella with renewed focus. Now that we don't have any more distractions, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Let's talk about what needs to be fixed. First, I want all of these centerpieces repositioned so they're perfectly centered, and I mean perfectly, not your approximation of perfect. Bella nodded, though she knew the centerpieces were already positioned correctly. Sometimes it was easier to humor difficult clients than to continue fighting battles that couldn't be won. Second, Victoria continued, I want the champagne glasses moved exactly 1 inch to the right. They're casting shadows that will ruin the ambiance in the photos. Again, Bella nodded, making mental notes of the requested changes. And third, Victoria said, her voice taking on a harder edge, I want you to understand that this is the most important day of my life. I've spent months planning every detail. And I've paid a lot of money to make sure everything is perfect. When staff members act like they know better than the bride, it creates unnecessary stress and drama. Do you understand what I'm saying? I understand, Bella replied, though what she understood was that Victoria was the kind of person who derived satisfaction from making others feel small. "Good," Victoria said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Because I'd hate to have to speak to your supervisor about your attitude. I'm sure you need this job, and I wouldn't want my disappointment with your service to affect your employment." The threat was delivered with such casual cruelty that Bella felt her breath catch in her throat. This wasn't just about table settings or centerpieces. This was about power, and the pleasure that some people took in wielding it over others who couldn't fight back. "I'll make sure everything is exactly as you want it," Bella said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sure you will," Victoria replied, already turning away to examine another aspect of the room setup. "And remember, I'll be watching to make sure the service during the reception meets the same standards I expect from the room setup." As Victoria's heels clicked across the floor toward the exit, Bella stood alone among the perfectly arranged tables, her hands shaking with a combination of anger and humiliation. She'd been working in service for years, and she'd dealt with difficult customers before, but there had been something particularly cruel about Victoria's behavior. It wasn't just about getting what she wanted. It was about making sure everyone around her knew exactly where they stood in her personal hierarchy. The other staff members gradually returned to their tasks, but Bella could feel their sympathetic glances as she began the meaningless task of adjusting centerpieces that were already perfect. She moved through the motions mechanically, her mind replaying every word of the confrontation and thinking of all the things she should have said but couldn't afford to. It was nearly an hour later when Alexander returned to the ballroom, this time dressed in his wedding attire. The morning coat fit him perfectly, emphasizing his tall frame and broad shoulders. But there was something about his expression that suggested the formal wear felt more like a costume than clothing. He paused near table 7, where Bella was making her third adjustment to the same centerpiece, and she looked up to find him watching her with an unreadable expression. "I'm sorry about earlier," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. Victoria gets stressed before big events, and sometimes she takes it out on people who don't deserve it. The unexpected apology caught Bella off guard, and she felt her defensive walls lower slightly. "It's fine," she said automatically, though they both knew it wasn't. "No, it's not fine," Alexander said, his dark eyes serious. "You were doing your job, and you were doing it well. She had no right to speak to you that way." Bella glanced around the ballroom, making sure they weren't being overheard. The last thing she needed was for Victoria to discover that her future husband was apologizing to the staff on her behalf. "Thank you for saying that," Bella said softly. "But you don't need to apologize for her. I know how stressful weddings can be." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the perfectly arranged table to Bella's face. "Do you enjoy working weddings?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested genuine curiosity. The question surprised her. Most clients barely acknowledged the existence of service staff, let alone asked about their job satisfaction. "Usually," Bella admitted, "I like being part of people's special days, even if it's just in the background. There's something magical about weddings when everything comes together perfectly." "And when it doesn't come together perfectly?" Alexander asked, and there was something almost wistful in his voice. Bella considered the question, thinking about all the weddings she'd witnessed over the years. The ones where the bride and groom barely looked at each other, where families sat in rigid silence, where the celebration felt more like a performance than a genuine brand. Expression of love. "Then it's just an expensive party," she said honestly, and immediately wondered if she'd spoken too freely. But Alexander smiled, and for the first time that day, the expression looked genuine. "That's remarkably insightful," he said. "I don't think I've ever heard anyone put it quite that way." Before Bella could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps announced Victoria's return. She swept back into the ballroom with the wedding photographer in tow, her dress rustling against the marble floor. "Alex, there you are," she called out, her voice bright with artificial cheer. "Roberto wants to get some shots of us with the reception set up before the ceremony begins. The lighting is perfect right now." Alexander straightened, and Bella watched as his expression shifted back to the carefully neutral mask he'd worn earlier. "Of course," he said, moving toward his bride with the mechanical movements of someone fulfilling an obligation. As the photographer began positioning the couple for shots among the tables that Bella had spent hours perfecting, she retreated to the service area to prepare for the ceremony. She had other duties to attend to, other tables to check, other details to manage, but she found herself glancing back at the couple posing for their pre-wedding brass photos, noticing how Victoria's smile was perfectly calibrated for the camera, while Alexander's eyes seemed to be looking at something far beyond the lens. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of expensive elegance. The manor's chapel had been transformed with thousands of white roses and greenery that cascaded from every available surface. The guest list read like a who's who of East Coast society, with politicians, business leaders, and celebrities filling the hand-carved pews. Bella worked behind the scenes during the service, making final preparations for the reception while the couple exchanged vows that had been written by Victoria's personal assistant and approved by both families' legal teams. Through the service monitors in the kitchen, she could see Alexander standing at the altar in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his expression serious as he promised to love, honor, and cherish his bride for the rest of their lives. Victoria looked stunning in her couture gown, every inch the fairy tale princess she'd always dreamed of being. Her vows were delivered with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed them extensively, each word perfectly enunciated for the cameras that were recording every moment. But even through the grainy security monitors, Bella could see something in Alexander's posture that suggested he was going through the motions rather than experiencing genuine joy. His responses were correct, his timing perfect, but there was an absence of the kind of radiant happiness that usually characterized grooms on their wedding day. The reception began with all the grandeur that Victoria had demanded. The ballroom had been transformed into a Beatine winter wonderland, with crystal chandeliers casting rainbow patterns across the white silk draping. The tables that had caused so much drama earlier in the day now served as the perfect backdrop for photographs that would undoubtedly grace the pages of several luxury lifestyle magazines. Bella moved through the crowd with practiced invisibility, refilling champagne glasses and clearing away empty plates with the kind of efficiency that made her seem almost ghost-like. She'd perfected the art of being present when needed and invisible when not, a skill that was essential for high-end service work. The bride and groom's first dance was performed to a string quartet that had been flown in from Vienna specifically for the occasion. Victoria had chosen a waltz that showcased her extensive dance lessons, and she moved across the floor with the grace of someone who had spent months perfecting every step. Alexander was an accomplished dancer as well, leading his new wife through the complex choreography with the kind of natural elegance that came from years of cotillion classes and society events. But even as he spun Victoria through the prescribed moves, Bella noticed that his attention seemed to wander, his gaze occasionally moving to the edges of the room where the staff worked quietly in the background. During the dinner service, Bella found herself assigned to the head table, where she could observe the newlyweds and their immediate families at close range. Victoria was in her element, holding court with a collection of socialites and influencers who hung on her every word. She regaled them with stories about the wedding planning process, the difficulties of finding the perfect dress, and the challenges of coordinating schedules with vendors who didn't understand the importance of perfection. Alexander sat beside his wife with the kind of polite attention that suggested he'd heard these stories many times before. He participated in the conversation when directly addressed, but Bella noticed that his responses were often generic, the kind of socially appropriate comments that can apply to almost any situation. It was during the main course that Victoria launched into another critique of the service, this time for the benefit of her table companions. "You wouldn't believe the drama we had this morning with the table settings," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the background music. "I had to practically redesign the entire room layout because the staff here obviously doesn't understand the difference between adequate and exceptional." Bella kept her expression neutral as she refilled water glasses, but she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. Several of Victoria's guests glanced in her direction with the kind of casual interest that people show when observing a performance they find mildly entertaining. "The problem with hiring local staff," continued Victoria, "is that they don't have experience with events at this level. They're used to setting up for corporate lunches and anniversary parties, not real celebrations that require attention to detail." Alexander set down his fork with more force than necessary, the sound of silver against china sharp enough to momentarily interrupt his wife's monologue. "The staff has been excellent," he said quietly, but his words carried enough authority to silence the table. "Everything looks exactly as we planned it." "Oh, Alex," Victoria laughed, reaching over to pat his hand with condescending affection. "You're so sweet to try to be diplomatic, but you don't have to pretend everything was perfect just to spare people's feelings. Our guests deserve to know the truth about the service they're receiving." The comment hung in the air like a challenge, and Bella found herself holding her breath as she waited to see how Alexander would respond. For a moment, his carefully controlled expression slipped, revealing something that looked remarkably like disgust. "I think," he said slowly, his voice carrying a warning that only his wife seemed to miss, "that our guests are more interested in celebrating with us than hearing complaints about the staff." "Of course they are," Victoria agreed brightly, apparently oblivious to the tension she'd created. "That's exactly why I want to make sure they're getting the kind of service they deserve. After all, we're all paying premium prices to be here." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Bella noticed that Alexander barely spoke for the rest of the dinner service. He went through the motions of eating, and occasionally nodding in appropriate moments, but his attention seemed to be elsewhere entirely. It was during the dessert course that Bella experienced one of the most surreal moments of her career. She was serving champagne for the toasts when Victoria suddenly grabbed her wrist, pulling her down to whisper in her ear. "I hope you've learned something today about the level of service that's expected at high-end events," Victoria said, her breath warm against Bella's ear and heavy with the scent of expensive champagne. "I'd hate for you to make the same mistakes at future weddings." The comment was delivered with a smile that suggested Victoria thought she was being helpful, offering constructive criticism that would benefit Bella's professional development. But there was something in her grip, something in the way she held Bella's wrist just a little too tightly, that made it clear the gesture was about power rather than mentorship. "I understand," Bella replied quietly, gently extracting her wrist from Victoria's grasp. "Thank you for the feedback. Good girl," Victoria said, with the kind of patronizing approval usually reserved for pets or small children. "I knew you'd be reasonable about it once you understood what was expected." As Bella moved away from the head table, she caught Alexander watching the interaction with an expression of barely controlled anger. His dark eyes met hers for just a moment, and she saw something there that looked like an apology mixed with shame. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of champagne service, cake cutting, and increasingly loud music as the older guests began to filter out and the younger crowd took over the dance floor. Victoria changed from her ceremony gown into a shorter reception dress that shone off her legs and made dancing easier, though she spent most of the evening holding court at a corner table surrounded by her closest friends. Alexander fulfilled his obligations as host, dancing with his mother-in-law, greeting distant relatives, and posing for endless photographs. But Bella noticed that he seemed to grow more distant as the evening progressed, his smiles becoming more mechanical and his responses increasingly brief. It was nearly midnight when the last guests finally departed, leaving behind a ballroom that looked like the aftermath of a very expensive storm. Empty champagne flutes covered every surface, flower petals were scattered across the dance floor, and the carefully arranged centerpieces had been disturbed by guests who had taken flowers as souvenirs. The cleanup crew worked with efficient precision, dismantling the fairy tale setting and returning the ballroom to its usual state of elegant neutrality. Bella moved through the familiar routine of collecting glassware, folding linens, and preparing the room for the deep cleaning that would happen after the staff went home. She was in the service corridor, loading dirty plates onto a cart, when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she was surprised to see Alexander approaching, still wearing his tuxedo, but with his bow tie undone and hanging loose around his neck. "I wanted to apologize again," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion, "for everything that happened today. You didn't deserve to be treated that way." Bella set down the stack of plates she'd been holding and turned to face him fully. Up close, she could see the stress lines around his eyes, the way his usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, the general air of someone who had just endured a long and difficult performance. "You don't need to apologize," she said softly. "It was your wedding day. You had other things to worry about. That's exactly why I need to apologize, Alexander replied, running a hand through his dark hair. A wedding should be about celebrating love and commitment, not about power trips and public humiliation. What happened today? The way Victoria spoke to you? That's not who I want to be associated with. The admission was so honest, so unexpectedly vulnerable, that Bella felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't the distant, perfectly controlled Groom she'd observed throughout the day. This was someone who seemed genuinely troubled by his new wife's behavior. "Are you okay?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Alexander looked surprised by the inquiry, as if he wasn't used to being asked about his emotional state. "I don't know," he admitted after a long pause. "I thought I was ready for this. For marriage, for all the responsibilities that come with my family name. But today, watching how Victoria treated you and the other staff, I started to wonder if I really know the person I just promised to spend my life with." The confession was so intimate, so far removed from the polite small talk that usually characterized interactions between staff and clients, that Bella wasn't sure how to respond. She could see the genuine distress in Alexander's dark eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to carry a weight that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "People act differently when they're stressed," she offered, though even as she said it, she knew the excuse was inadequate. Victoria's behavior had been too consistent, too calculated, to be explained away by wedding day nerves. "Do they?" Alexander asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't really looking for an answer. Or, do stressful situations just reveal who people really are, underneath all the social training and public expectations? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond a discussion of wedding day behavior. Bella could see that Alexander was wrestling with doubts that went to the very core of the commitment he'd just made. "I should go," she said quietly, suddenly aware that this conversation was veering into territory that was inappropriate for a staff member and a client, especially a client who had just gotten married. "Of course," Alexander said, stepping back to give her space. "I'm sorry for keeping you. I know you've been working all day, and you probably want to get home." But instead of walking away, he remained standing in the corridor, his hands in his pockets and his expression troubled. There was something about his posture that reminded Bella of a lost child, despite his expensive clothes and obvious wealth. "For what it's worth," she said, surprising herself with her boldness, "I've worked a lot of weddings, and I can usually tell which couples are going to make it, and which ones are just going through the motions. Love shows, even when people are trying to hide it. And what did you see today?" "And?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Bella considered the question carefully, thinking about all the interactions she'd witnessed throughout the day. The way Victoria had treated her future husband like an accessory to her perfect day. The way Alexander had seemed to be performing rather than celebrating. The complete absence of the kind of intimate moments that usually characterized couples on their wedding day. "I saw two people who wanted very different things," she said honestly. "And I'm not sure either of you got what you were looking for." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, absorbing her words with the kind of serious consideration that suggested they'd confirmed suspicions he'd been trying to ignore. "Thank you," he said finally, "for your honesty. Most people in your position would just tell me what they thought I wanted to hear. Most people in my position don't get asked for their opinion," Bella replied with a small smile. Alexander smiled back, and for the first time all day, the expression looked completely genuine. "Maybe they should," he said. "You seem to see things more clearly than most of the people in my usual social circle." The compliment was unexpected and more meaningful than any tip she'd ever received. Bella felt warmth spreading through her chest, a reaction that was entirely inappropriate given the circumstances, but impossible to ignore. "I should really get back to work," she said, though she made no move to leave. "And I should get back to my wedding reception," Alexander replied, though he didn't move either. They stood there for another moment, suspended in a bubble of honesty that felt separate from the elaborate performance that had characterized the rest of the day. Then the sound of voices from the ballroom broke the spell, reminding them both of their respective roles and responsibilities. "Congratulations on your marriage," Bella said formally, stepping back into her professional persona. "Thank you," Alexander replied. But there was something in his tone that suggested the congratulations felt premature. As Bella watched him walk back toward the ballroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just witnessed something significant, though she wasn't sure exactly what. The conversation had felt more real, more honest, than most of the interactions she'd had with clients over the years. But it had also left her with questions she couldn't answer, and feelings she wasn't sure she should be having. The rest of the cleanup passed quickly, and soon Bella found herself in the staff locker room, changing out of her uniform and into the jeans and sweater she'd worn to work that morning. The contrast between her regular clothes and the formal attire felt like shedding a costume, returning to her real identity after hours of playing a role. She was gathering her things when she noticed the small velvet box sitting on the shelf of her locker. It was deep blue with gold trim, a kind of elegant packaging that suggested expensive jewelry. For a moment, she thought someone had made a mistake, leaving their personal belongings in the wrong locker. But when she picked up the box, she found a small envelope attached with her name written in elegant handwriting. Inside the envelope was a note written on heavy cream paper, the kind of stationery that probably cost more than her weekly grocery budget. "Bella," the note began, "you were the most beautiful person at that wedding. I had to walk away, but I won't forget you. This is a small token of my appreciation for your kindness and your honesty. You deserve to be treasured, not diminished. With respect and admiration, A.B." Bella's hands trembled as she opened the velvet box, revealing a necklace that took her breath away. The pendant was a single diamond surrounded by smaller stones, set in platinum that caught the fluorescent lights of the locker room and threw rainbows across the walls. Even to her untrained eye, it was clearly worth a fortune. She sank onto the bench behind her, staring at the necklace and trying to process what had just happened. Alexander Blackstone, heir to one of the most powerful business empires in the country, had just given her a piece of jewelry that was worth more than she made in several years. The implications were staggering, and she wasn't sure whether to feel flattered, confused, or terrified. The note was signed with his initials, but the sentiment behind it was unmistakably personal. He had called her beautiful, not just physically, but in a way that suggested he'd seen something in her character that had impressed him. The gift itself was generous beyond anything she could have imagined, but it was the words that made her heart race. Bella carefully placed the necklace back in its box and slipped both the jewelry and the note into her purse. She needed time to think, to figure out what this gesture meant and how she should respond. Walking home through the quiet streets of the city, she replayed every interaction she'd had with Alexander throughout the day, looking for clues about his intentions. By the time she reached her small apartment, Bella had convinced herself that the gift was simply an extremely generous tip, a wealthy man's way of apologizing for his wife's behavior. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the way Alexander had looked at her in the service corridor, she knew there was more to it than that. The next morning brought a flood of social media posts from the wedding guests, all praising the elegant reception and the fairy tale romance of the bride and groom. Victoria's official wedding photos were already appearing on luxury lifestyle blogs, with detailed descriptions of her dress, the floral arrangements, and the exclusive guest list. But buried among the congratulatory messages and admiring comments, Bella noticed something interesting. While there were dozens of photos of Victoria looking radiant in her various wedding outfits, there were very few candid shots of the couple together. Most of the images showed them posed formally for official photographs, with the kind of practiced smiles that suggested professional coaching rather than spontaneous joy. Bella spent the weekend trying to return to her normal routine, but she found herself constantly distracted by thoughts of Alexander and the necklace that was hidden in her jewelry box. She researched the Blackstone family online, learning about their extensive business holdings and their reputation for philanthropy. Alexander himself had graduated from Harvard Business School and was being groomed to take over the family's investment firm, though several articles mentioned his interest in environmental causes and sustainable business practices. The more she learned about him, the more their conversation in the service corridor made sense. Alexander was someone who had been raised with wealth and privilege, but who seemed to have developed a conscience about how that privilege should be used. His distress over Victoria's treatment of the service staff wasn't just about politeness, It was about fundamental values regarding how people should treat each other. On Monday morning, Bella returned to work at the manor with mixed feelings. Part of her hoped she might see Alexander again, while another part of her dreaded the awkwardness of their next encounter. But as the days passed without any sign of him, she began to wonder if the entire incident had been a momentary impulse that he now regretted. It was nearly a week later when Miranda, the wedding coordinator, approached Bella with an unusual request. "I just got a call from Alexander Blackstone," Miranda said, her voice carefully neutral. "He wants to arrange a private dinner in our smaller dining room, and he specifically requested that you be assigned as his server." Bella felt her stomach drop. "Did he say why?" "He mentioned wanting to thank the staff who made his wedding so special," Miranda replied, though her expression suggested she found the explanation as puzzling as Bella did. "It's unusual, but the Blackstones are very important clients, so we're going to accommodate the request." The dinner was scheduled for the following Thursday, and Bella spent the intervening days in a state of nervous anticipation. She wasn't sure what Alexander wanted from her, but she knew that their conversation would go far beyond the usual pleasantries between staff and clients. Thursday evening arrived with unseasonable warmth for early spring, and Bella found herself checking her appearance in the staff bathroom mirror more times than was strictly professional. She'd chosen her best uniform and made sure her hair was perfectly arranged, though she wasn't entirely sure why it mattered. The manor's smaller dining room was intimate by the building's standards, seating only 20 people at most. But for Alexander's private dinner, only one table was set, positioned near the windows that overlooked the gardens. The setting was elegant but understated, with simple white linens and a small arrangement of spring flowers. Alexander arrived precisely on time, dressed in a dark suit that was obviously expensive but less formal than his wedding attire. He looked tired, Bella noticed, with shadows under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. "Thank you for agreeing to serve tonight," he said as she approached his table. "I know this is an unusual request." "It's not a problem," Bella replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "What can I get you to drink?" "Actually," Alexander said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him, "I was hoping you might join me. I know it's not protocol, but I'd rather have a conversation than a formal sell." Dinner service. The request was so far outside normal procedure that Bella wasn't sure how to respond. Fraternizing with clients was strictly forbidden, and sitting down to dine with a guest could cost her job if the wrong person found out about it. "I don't think that would be appropriate," she said carefully. "Please," Alexander said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost desperate. "I need to talk to someone who isn't part of my world, someone who can give me an honest perspective on what's happening in my life. I'll make sure there are no consequences for you professionally." Bella looked around the empty dining room, calculating the risks. The kitchen staff was busy with cleanup from the main restaurant, and Miranda had already left for the day. If she was careful, no one would need to know that she deviated from standard service protocol. "Just for a few minutes," she said, pulling out the chair and sitting down across from him. Alexander smiled with what looked like relief. "Thank you. I know this puts you in a difficult position, but I didn't know who else to talk to." "What about your friends?" Bella asked. "Or your family?" "My friends are Victoria's friends now," Alexander said with bitter honesty. "And my family, well, they're thrilled about the marriage. Victoria comes from the right background, she has the right social connections, and she'll be an asset to the family business. From their perspective, everything worked out perfectly. But not from your perspective?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the gardens where the last light of day was fading into dusk. The morning after the wedding, Victoria spent 2 hours on social media, posting photos and responding to comments about how perfect everything was. She had already started planning our first anniversary party, talking about which magazines she wanted to feature our story. "That doesn't sound unusual for a new bride," Bella said, though she could hear the underlying criticism in his tone. "Maybe not," Alexander agreed. "But when I suggested we talk about our honeymoon plans, about where we wanted to travel together, she said she'd already booked us a resort in the Maldives because it would photograph well. Everything is about the image, about maintaining the perfect facade." Bella could see the frustration in Alexander's expression, the way his hands clenched and unclenched as he spoke. This wasn't just disappointment about specific incidents. This was a fundamental mismatch of values and priorities. "Have you talked to her about how you feel?" Bella asked. "I tried," Alexander said with a humorless laugh. "She told me I was being overly sensitive, that all couples go through an adjustment period after marriage. She said once we settle into our routine, I'll appreciate how well organized she is, how efficiently she manages our social calendar. And you don't want your life to be efficiently managed? I want my life to feel real," Alexander said, his voice carrying a passion that had been completely absent during his wedding ceremony. "I want to have conversations that matter, experiences that aren't choreographed for social media, relationships that are based on genuine connection rather than mutual benefit." The longing in his voice was so apparent that Bella felt her heart ache for him. Here was someone who had everything that money could buy, but who was missing the one thing that actually mattered: authentic human connection. "Why did you marry her?" Bella asked gently. Alexander considered the question for a long time before answering. "Because it made sense," he said finally. "Because everyone expected it. Because it would be good for business. Because I thought maybe I could learn to love her the way she deserved to be loved. I convinced myself that compatibility was more important than passion, that shared goals were more valuable than shared dreams. And now? Now I realize that you can't build a life with someone you don't actually like," Alexander said bluntly. "Victoria isn't a bad person, but she's not someone I would choose to spend time with if we weren't married. We don't laugh at the same things, we don't value the same experiences, and we certainly don't treat other people the same way." The reference to Victoria's treatment of the service staff hung in the air between them, a reminder of the incident that had brought them together in the first place. "What are you going to do?" Bella asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "I don't know," Alexander admitted. "But I know that I can't keep pretending to be happy in a relationship that feels like a performance. And I know that meeting you has made me realize how much I'd been settling for in my personal life." "Meeting me?" "Me?" Bella repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have something that most people in my social circle have lost," Alexander said, his eyes never leaving her face. "You're genuine. You say what you mean, you treat people with respect regardless of their status, and you're not afraid to challenge ideas that don't make sense to you. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" The compliment was so heartfelt, so specific, that Bella felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. No one had ever described her in those terms before, and hearing it from someone like Alexander made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced before. "You don't know me," she said, though the protest sounded weak even to her own ears. "I know enough," Alexander replied. "I know that you take pride in your work even when people don't appreciate it. I know that you stood up for yourself when Victoria was being unreasonable, even though it could have cost you your job. I know that you were kind to me when you had no obligation to be, and I know that you're sitting here now because you care about people. Even people whose problems must seem pretty trivial compared to your own." Each observation was accurate, and together they painted a picture of her character that was more flattering than any compliment she'd ever received about her appearance. Alexander had been paying attention to her in a way that felt both thrilling and dangerous. "What you're suggesting, it's not fair to anyone involved," Bella said, though her voice lacked conviction. "You're right," Alexander agreed. "It's not fair to you to be put in this position. It's not fair to Victoria to be married to someone who doesn't love her. And it's not fair to me to spend my life pretending to be someone I'm not. But I'm not sure fairness is possible in this situation." The admission was brutally honest, and it crystallized the impossible nature of their circumstances. There were no good choices, no solutions that wouldn't hurt someone. "I need time to think," Bella said finally. "Of course," Alexander said, sitting back in his chair. "I'm not asking you to make any decisions tonight. I'm just asking you to consider the possibility that sometimes the most responsible thing you can do is admit when you've made a mistake." As Bella walked home that night, her mind was spinning with everything Alexander had said. The rational part of her knew that getting involved with a married man, especially a client, was a terrible idea that could only end badly. But the emotional part of her was drawn to his honesty, his vulnerability, and the way he seemed to see qualities in her that she hadn't even known she possessed. 3 months later, Alexander filed for divorce. The proceedings were handled as discreetly as possible, but within weeks, the story had leaked to the society pages. Victoria handled the publicity with strategic precision, positioning herself as the wronged party while launching a lifestyle brand based on her wedding experience. Alexander, meanwhile, had stepped back from his family's business to pursue environmental consulting, a decision that shocked his parents, but seemed to energize him in ways Bella had never seen during their clandestine cyber meetings. On a quiet evening in late autumn, nearly a year after the wedding that had changed both their lives, Alexander and Bella sat in a small cafe across town from the manor, no longer hiding their relationship from the world. Bella wore the diamond necklace for the first time, its brilliance catching the soft light as she reached across the table to take Alexander's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "All the complications, all the people who got hurt along the way?" Alexander considered the question seriously, as he always did. "I regret that it took so long for all of us to figure out what we actually wanted," he said finally. "I regret that Victoria had to go through a public divorce, and I regret that my family still doesn't understand why I couldn't just make the marriage work. But I don't regret us. I don't regret taking the chance to build something real." Bella smiled, thinking about how far they'd both come from that morning when she'd been just a waitress being yelled at about centerpieces. She'd left the manor 6 months ago to start her own catering company, specializing in intimate events that prioritize genuine hospitality over ostentatious displays. Alexander had become her first investor and biggest supporter, but more importantly, he'd become the person who saw her most clearly and loved her most completely. "Neither do I," she said, squeezing his hand gently. "Neither do I." Outside the cafe windows, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, covering the city in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. Inside, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances sat holding hands across a small table, building something authentic together, one honest conversation at a time.